Nathan Caldwell knew how to command a room. He had spent years perfecting the art of control, the sharp-cut suits, the measured tone, the effortless confidence that made men respect him and women lean in just a little closer. He didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. Power had its own gravity, and he had long since learned that people naturally orbited those who held it. And yet, standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of his private penthouse suite in Miami's most exclusive oceanfront resort, Nathan felt something he hadn't in a long time: a whisper of unease. Below him, the world carried on as it always did. The sun painted the Atlantic in hues of gold, waves rolling in rhythmic certainty against the shore. Couples strolled hand in hand along the boardwalk, laughter and conversation floating up in a distant hum. He exhaled slowly, swirling the glass of bourbon in his hand. He should be working. There were emails to answer, deals to close, a billion-dollar empire that didn't stop just because he had decided to step away for a few days. But even with his phone turned off and his schedule wiped clear, his mind refused to be still. This wasn't a vacation. Not really. His assistant had all but shoved him onto his private jet, insisting that he take time away before he burned out completely. He had humored the suggestion, telling himself that a few days in Miami would be good for optics, a way to remind investors that the man leading Caldwell Technologies wasn't just a machine. But the truth? Nathan didn't know what to do with himself when there was nothing demanding his attention. His entire life had been built on momentum. The next goal, the next acquisition, the next mountain to conquer. He had clawed his way to the top of the tech world, building an empire from nothing. His name was spoken in the same breath as Silicon Valley legends, and his influence stretched far beyond the sleek glass walls of his headquarters. By any measure of success, he had won. Then why did it feel like he was losing something? The feeling crept in more often these days, slipping through the cracks of his carefully curated life like water through stone. It wasn't loneliness. Not exactly. Nathan had never struggled for company. He had his pick of exclusive invitations, high-profile parties, women who wanted a taste of the life he had built. But none of it lasted. None of it filled the spaces that had grown empty over the years. He lifted his glass to his lips, the bourbon burning smooth down his throat. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe stepping away from work, even for a few days, had left him vulnerable to thoughts he usually didn't entertain. With a sharp exhale, he turned from the window. Enough of this. If he wasn't going to work, he needed a distraction. The resort's lounge was one floor below, and if there was one thing Miami never lacked, it was entertainment. A drink, a conversation, something to break the cycle of restless thoughts. Nathan grabbed his blazer and shrugged it on, stepping out of the suite and into the private elevator. The doors slid shut with a quiet chime, the descent smooth and soundless. By the time he stepped into the lounge, the air had shifted. Low lighting, murmured conversation, the scent of expensive liquor and salt from the ocean beyond the open terrace. Wealth had a certain rhythm. It was in the way people moved, in the effortless grace of women in designer heels and men who had never had to count a dollar in their lives. Nathan took a seat at the bar, nodding to the bartender. "The usual, Mr. Caldwell." He hesitated for half a second. His usual was fine, but fine felt unremarkable tonight. "Make it something different," he said, voice smooth. "Surprise me." The bartender nodded and went to work. Nathan let his gaze drift over the lounge, cataloging faces without real interest. Same crowd, same conversations. He almost sighed, about to turn back to his drink, and then he saw her. At first, his mind played tricks on him. It had to be, because Isabel Montgomery wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere near his world ever again. Yet there she stood, framed by the soft glow of the lobby's chandelier, talking to the front desk attendant with an air of quiet elegance. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, wisps escaping to frame her face. She hadn't changed, at least not in the way that mattered. Still beautiful, still composed, still the only woman who had ever managed to slip past the fortress he had built around himself. But it wasn't just her presence that sent his heart into an unsteady rhythm. It was the small child standing beside her, gripping her hand tightly. A little girl, no older than 3. Nathan's breath hitched, because the child had his eyes. Green, strikingly familiar. A slow, numbing realization settled in his chest. Isabel wasn't alone, and the daughter at her side looked far too much like him to be a coincidence. Nathan's world tilted beneath him. For the first time in years, he felt completely, utterly unmoored. His grip on the crystal tumbler in his hand tightened, but his body refused to move. The conversation around him faded into nothing, the music a dull hum in the background. His focus narrowed on one thing, one impossible sight that shattered everything he thought he knew. Isabel, and the child standing beside her. Nathan's pulse pounded in his ears as he watched Isabel lean down to whisper something to the little girl, her hand resting gently on the child's dark curls. The girl responded with a small nod, her tiny fingers tightening around Isabel's. The way she clung to her mother, the protective instinct in Isabel's posture, the unmistakable shade of green in her wide, curious eyes. Nathan didn't need to ask. He already knew. The child was his. A sharp breath left him, and he set his drink down before his shaking fingers could betray him. What the hell was happening? How had this happened? The timeline snapped together in his mind with brutal precision. 3 years since he'd last seen Isabel. 3 years since she had walked away from their marriage, leaving behind nothing but divorce papers and silence. And now, a child. His child. Nathan forced himself to stand, the movement slow, deliberate. The logical side of him, the part that had built an empire from nothing, told him to approach calmly, to demand answers, to control the narrative before it unraveled completely. But the other part of him, the one that felt raw and exposed in a way he hadn't in years, wasn't sure what he'd say when he reached her. His feet moved before he made the decision to go. Isabel still hadn't noticed him. She was preoccupied at the front desk, speaking with the concierge, shifting the little girl's weight slightly as she adjusted the small overnight bag slung over her shoulder. And then, as if some invisible thread connected them, she turned. Her gaze collided with his. Nathan watched, mesmerized, as a wave of emotions flickered across her face. First, shock. Then something sharper, dread. For a second, neither of them moved. The space between them stretched impossibly wide, even as memories crashed between them like an unrelenting tide. The first time he saw her across a newsroom, fire in her eyes as she tore into a senator's evasive responses. The way she had once fit so perfectly beside him, challenging him, grounding him, making him feel something real in a world where everything felt transactional. The night she left, her voice low and tired as she whispered, "I can't do this anymore, Nathan." And now she was here, standing in the same luxury resort, holding a child that had his features. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. "Isabel." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her fingers curled instinctively around the little girl's shoulder, as if bracing herself for whatever was coming next. Then finally she spoke. "Nathan." It was just his name, nothing more. But the way she said it, soft, wary, set something hot and bitter stirring inside him. For years he had imagined what it would be like if he ever saw her again. None of his imagined scenarios had prepared him for this. Nathan glanced down at the little girl again. She was staring up at him now, wide-eyed and curious, her expression cautious but not fearful. She didn't know who he was, didn't know that he had spent the last 3 years unaware of her very existence. His throat went dry. "Is there something you want to tell me?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath the words. Isabel inhaled sharply, her spine stiffening. He knew that look, the one that told him she was already preparing for a fight. She faltered for the briefest second, then her gaze flickered toward the child. Nathan followed her glance. Not here. That's what she was thinking. That's what was stopping her from telling the truth outright. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to take a step back. He had 1,000 things to say, but none of them should be spoken in front of a child who didn't even understand the weight of what was happening. "Where are you staying?" he asked instead, his voice low and even. Isabel hesitated. She knew exactly what he was asking. She could lie, she could run. She had done both before. But this time something in her gaze shifted, a decision made in real time. She exhaled, adjusting the bag on her shoulder. "Room 327. Nathan nodded once. "I'll be there in an hour." It wasn't a question. Isabel held his gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. A challenge, a warning. Then, without another word, she took the little girl's hand and led her toward the elevator. Nathan stood frozen, watching them disappear behind the closing doors. His fingers curled into fists. An hour. In an hour, he would finally have the answers he had been denied for 3 years. Nathan Caldwell had faced adversaries who would do anything to see him fail. He had navigated billion-dollar deals, outmaneuvered rivals who played dirty, and stared down men who would kill to hold the kind of power he wielded. But nothing, not a hostile takeover, not a boardroom full of wolves, had ever prepared him for this. For her. For them. Room 327. The numbers burned in his mind as he stood outside the door, fists clenched at his sides. He could hear the muffled sounds of movement inside, Isabel's voice, soft but firm, followed by the rustling of fabric, a child's light footsteps. Then silence. Nathan exhaled, pressing his knuckles against the door. A beat. Then another. The lock clicked. The door cracked open. Isabel stood before him, bathed in the warm glow of the hotel room's soft lighting. Her expression was unreadable, but her body language was tense, like a woman bracing for impact. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then finally she stepped aside. "Come in." Nathan did. The suite was modest compared to his own, but it was still high-end, neutral tones, crisp linens, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean. The sliding balcony doors were cracked open, allowing the scent of salt and jasmine to drift in with the breeze. But he barely noticed. His attention snapped to the small figure curled up on the couch, surrounded by a pile of stuffed animals. The little girl, his little girl, was fast asleep. Her dark curls framed her face, lashes resting against cheeks that still held the softness of early childhood. One tiny hand clutched a well-worn plush rabbit, the other resting near her face. Nathan stared. For a man who had built an empire on intelligence, analysis, and logic, he suddenly felt like he understood nothing at all. His chest felt tight, something raw clawing its way to the surface. She was beautiful, perfect, and she had been a stranger to him until now. His voice, when he finally found it, was hoarse. Her name. Isabel hesitated, then, softly, "Lena. Lena." The name settled deep, burrowing into him like a secret he had been waiting his whole life to hear. He turned back to Isabel. "She's mine." It wasn't a question. Isabel crossed her arms, her gaze steady, despite the flicker of emotion beneath it. "Yes." A sharp exhale left him. He ran a hand over his jaw, shaking his head. 3 years, Isabel. His voice was quieter than he expected, no less intense, but controlled. You kept my daughter from me for 3 years. She swallowed but didn't look away. I didn't. She stopped, exhaled. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Nathan let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. Then tell me, how exactly was it supposed to be? Isabel pressed her lips together. She glanced toward Lena before gesturing for him to step onto the balcony. Nathan followed. The door slid shut behind them, muffling the room's warmth and replacing it with the salty breeze of the ocean. Below, the city glittered. High-rises and neon lights, yachts gliding through the bay like shadows. Nathan turned to her. Explain. Isabel crossed her arms again, gripping her elbows like she was holding herself together. By the time I found out I was pregnant, we were already over, Nathan. Her voice was steady, but there was an old wound buried beneath it. I was leaving and you... She broke off, exhaling sharply. You barely even noticed. Nathan's jaw clenched. That's not true. Isn't it? Her gaze met his, unflinching. You were in the middle of a merger, spending 20 hours a day in boardrooms or on planes. I knew where I ranked on your priority list. Nathan's fists curled at his sides. And instead of telling me, giving me the choice, you left. Isabel's expression flickered. I didn't think you would want this. She gestured toward the room, toward Lena sleeping peacefully inside. You never wanted a family. You made that clear. Nathan exhaled sharply. And you thought deciding for me was better? Her lips parted, then closed. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, pacing once before stopping in front of her. You should have told me. His voice was lower now, rough with something he didn't want to name. No matter what you thought, no matter what we were going through, you should have told me. Isabel's expression tightened, but when she spoke, her voice was quieter. I was scared. Nathan stilled. She looked away, staring at the skyline. I was scared you'd fight me for her, that you'd see her as another responsibility to manage. Her fingers clenched around her arms. And I was scared that if I let you in, you'd walk away when it got inconvenient. Nathan inhaled sharply. He should have been angry, should have lashed out at the accusation. But deep down, he knew why she had thought that. Because once upon a time she wouldn't have been wrong. He had been ruthless when they were together, consumed by work, detached from anything that didn't serve his ambitions. Love had been secondary, something that existed only if it didn't interfere with the machine he had built around himself. Isabel had left because she was tired of fighting for space in his life. And now, 3 years later, she stood before him, still unsure if she had made the right choice. Nathan exhaled. He let the truth settle inside him. Heavy, unforgiving. Finally, he spoke. I'm not that man anymore. Isabel's gaze flickered toward him. I want to believe that. Nathan met her eyes. Then let me prove it. She hesitated. And if you can't? A beat of silence passed between them, thick with unspoken history. Nathan's expression was unreadable, but his voice was certain. I don't lose. Isabel's lips parted, but before she could respond, a soft sound reached them. A tiny voice from inside. Mommy? Isabel's eyes darted toward the door. Nathan followed. Through the glass, Lena was awake, rubbing sleep from her eyes, blinking in confusion at the empty space beside her. Nathan's chest tightened. Isabel exhaled, stepping toward the door. She paused, glancing back at him. I don't know if I can trust you yet, Nathan. Her voice was soft but firm. But if you want to be in her life, you have to earn it. Nathan didn't hesitate. Then tell me where to start. Nathan had faced challenges before. He had sat across from cutthroat executives who would sell their souls for a fraction of his success. He had turned competitors into relics of the past with a single calculated move. He had built an empire from nothing but his own ambition and refused to apologize for the sacrifices it took to get there. And yet nothing, not the boardrooms, not the late-night negotiations, not the relentless pursuit of power, had prepared him for this moment. For standing in a dimly lit hotel room, watching his daughter rub sleep from her eyes while her mother studied him with quiet skepticism, Lena blinked up at Isabel, confusion evident in her small face. "Mommy?" Her voice was soft, uncertain. Isabel moved instinctively, crouching beside the couch. "I'm right here, sweetheart," she murmured, brushing gentle fingers over Lena's curls. "Did you sleep okay?" Lena nodded sleepily, then looked past her mother, her gaze landing on Nathan. For a moment, all he could do was stare back. His heart slammed against his ribs, the weight of her tiny gaze crushing in ways he hadn't expected. She was so small, so fragile. And yet, she was a piece of him, a piece he hadn't even known existed until tonight. Lena tilted her head slightly, looking at him with open curiosity. She didn't seem scared, just hesitant. Nathan swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "Hey there," he said, keeping his voice gentle, careful. "You must be Lena." Lena didn't respond right away. She just studied him, the same way she might study a new toy she wasn't sure she wanted yet. Finally, she nodded. Nathan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Progress. Isabel stood, smoothing a hand over Lena's hair, before glancing at Nathan. "It's late. I should get her back to sleep." Nathan nodded, but the reluctance in his chest was impossible to ignore. He didn't want to leave yet. Not when he had just found them. Not when his daughter had just looked at him for the first time. Isabel hesitated, as if sensing his thoughts. "We can talk in the morning," she said, quieter this time. Nathan met her gaze. He didn't trust easily, but he understood when someone was giving him a chance, however small. And this was his one chance. "I'll be here," he said. Isabel nodded. Then, without another word, she turned back to Lena and gently lifted her into her arms. Nathan stood frozen, watching as she carried their daughter to the bedroom and softly closed the door behind them. He let out a slow, measured breath. Everything had changed. And tomorrow, he would begin proving he was worthy of it. The next morning, Nathan was up before dawn. He wasn't a man who wasted time. If there was a problem, he solved it. If there was an obstacle, he moved through it. And right now, the greatest challenge of his life was figuring out how to build a bridge between himself and the daughter he had never known. By the time the sun had fully risen over Miami's skyline, Nathan was already seated in the resort's outdoor cafe, waiting for them. The sound of small footsteps made his breath catch. He turned. Isabel walked toward him, Lena's tiny hand clasped in hers. His stomach tightened at the sight of them. In the morning light, Isabel looked different, softer, less guarded. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and she wore a casual sundress that made it impossible not to remember a time when things between them had been effortless. Lena, however, was his entire focus. She was awake now, fully alert, her tiny face set in an expression of quiet curiosity. He watched as her gaze flickered around the cafe before landing on him again. Nathan inhaled slowly. "Here goes nothing." "Good morning," he said, careful not to make his voice too loud, too overwhelming. Lena stared at him for a long moment. Then, to his complete and utter shock, she spoke. "Hi." It was soft, barely above a whisper, but it was enough to make something in Nathan's chest tighten in ways he hadn't felt in years. He forced himself to stay steady. Calm. "Do you like pancakes?" he asked, nodding toward the table. Lena glanced at Isabel as if seeking permission. Isabel gave her a reassuring nod. "You can tell him, sweetheart." Lena turned back to Nathan and, after a moment, nodded. Nathan couldn't help it. He smiled. "Good choice," he murmured. "Me too." Isabel pulled out a chair for Lena and helped her into it before taking a seat herself. Nathan watched as his daughter reached for a napkin, fiddling with the corner of it absent-mindedly. She was shy. That much was obvious. But she was also watching him, carefully, quietly, as if deciding what to make of him. Nathan wasn't used to being under scrutiny. Not like this. Not in a way that mattered. For the first time in his life, his wealth, his power, his success, none of it meant anything. Not here. Not to the only person whose opinion might actually matter. He took a slow breath, picking up the menu. "How about we order the biggest stack of pancakes they have?" Lena's eyes widened slightly. Then, hesitantly, she nodded. And just like that, Nathan knew. It wasn't going to be easy, but for her, he would do whatever it took. Nathan had closed multi-billion-dollar deals with nothing more than a handshake. He had built an empire on decisiveness, on knowing when to push and when to retreat. But sitting across from Lena at breakfast, watching her carefully scoop syrup onto her pancakes with tiny, deliberate movements, he had never felt more out of his depth. She still wasn't sure what to make of him, and he didn't blame her. Isabel sat beside her, quiet but watchful. She wasn't hovering, but she was present, as if ready to step in at the first sign that this was too much for their daughter. Their daughter. The words still felt foreign. Nathan lifted his coffee cup, more for something to do with his hands than any real need for caffeine. "I heard you like puzzles," he said, keeping his tone easy, casual. Lena glanced up at him, her green eyes, his eyes, blinking in surprise. Isabel had told him that last night, just before they had parted ways. It had been a small detail, a tiny fact about the little girl who was a stranger and yet a part of him. Lena hesitated, then nodded. A small victory. Nathan leaned forward slightly. "I'm terrible at them," he admitted, lowering his voice as if confessing a secret. "I always end up putting the pieces in the wrong places." Lena frowned, considering this. Then, very softly, she said, "You have to look at the picture first." Nathan stilled. It was the first real sentence she had said to him, the first piece of advice she had ever given her father. He swallowed the unexpected lump in his throat. That makes sense. Lena gave another tiny nod before turning back to her plate. Nathan let out a slow breath, resisting the urge to glance at Isabel. He didn't need to see her expression to know she had caught it too, the small but significant step forward. For the next few minutes, breakfast carried on in quiet normalcy. Lena ate in small bites, her tiny legs swinging slightly under the table. Every now and then she'd glance at him, cautious but intrigued. It wasn't much, but it was something. Nathan was about to ask her another question, something simple, something easy, when a shadow fell over the table. "Isabel." Nathan immediately recognized the voice. A woman stood beside them, hands on her hips, eyes flickering between Isabel and him with barely concealed suspicion. Isabel exhaled, rubbing her temple. "Sophia." Nathan had never met her before, but he knew exactly who she was. Sophia Delgado, Isabel's best friend, the woman who had been in her corner even before Nathan had come into the picture. And judging by the way she was looking at him now, she wasn't happy to see him. "I thought you were supposed to be on vacation," Sophia said, crossing her arms. "Didn't realize your ex-husband was part of the itinerary." Nathan let the words roll off his back, but Isabel tensed. Lena, oblivious to the sudden shift in tension, continued cutting her pancake into tiny, even squares. "Sophia, not now," Isabel murmured. Sophia arched a brow. "Not now?" She let out a sharp laugh, then turned to Nathan. "So what is this? Some kind of guilt trip? You ignore them for 3 years and now decide you want to play dad?" Nathan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "I didn't know about Lena." Sophia's expression hardened. "And that's supposed to make it better?" Isabel shot her friend a warning look. "Sophia!" But Sophia wasn't finished. "You know what? No, you don't get to act like the victim here." She turned back to Nathan. "Do you have any idea what Isabel went through? What it was like to raise a baby on her own while you were off running your empire?" Nathan inhaled slowly, keeping his gaze steady. "No," he said. "I don't." That seemed to catch her off guard. Sophia's arms tightened around her chest, her glare not softening. "And now what? You think you can just show up and everything will magically fall into place?" Nathan met her stare without flinching. "No," he said again. "I know it won't." Sophia opened her mouth, then shut it. Something in his tone must have reached her because, for the first time, she hesitated. Nathan took a slow sip of his coffee, keeping his voice steady. "You don't have to trust me," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere." Sophia let out a slow breath, her jaw still tight. "We'll see." She shot Isabel another pointed look, then crouched beside Lena, her expression softening. "Hey, sweetheart," she murmured, brushing a curl from the little girl's forehead. "You doing okay?" Lena nodded, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of pancake. Sophia pressed a kiss to the top of her head, then stood. "I'll see you later," she told Isabel, her tone making it clear that the conversation wasn't over. With one last glance at Nathan, she turned and walked away. A tense silence settled over the table. Nathan exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders back. "That went well." Isabel sighed, rubbing her forehead. "She's protective. I can see that." "She's not wrong," Isabel admitted. "She's been with me since the beginning. She saw what I went through. She has every reason to be skeptical." Nathan nodded slowly. "And what about you?" Isabel hesitated. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, her gaze dropping for a moment before she finally looked up at him. "I don't know yet." Nathan had spent his life negotiating with men who would do anything to win. He knew how to read people, how to anticipate their moves before they made them. But looking at Isabel now, he couldn't predict where this was going. He only knew one thing. He wasn't giving up. Lena's tiny voice cut through the silence. "Can I have more syrup?" Nathan blinked. Then, against all odds, he laughed. It was quiet, low, but real. The kind of laugh he hadn't heard from himself in years. Isabel looked at him, startled for half a second. Then, before she could stop it, her lips twitched. Nathan reached for the syrup, poured a little more onto Lena's plate, and slid it back toward her. "There you go," he murmured. Lena looked at her pancake. Then, finally, she looked up at him and smiled. A small smile. But it was real. And for the first time since walking into this storm, Nathan felt like he had won something worth more than any business deal. Nathan never allowed distractions. His life was built on control, on predicting moves before they were made, eliminating variables before they could become threats. Yet, as he sat across from Isabel and Lena, watching his daughter carefully stack sugar packets into a tiny pyramid, he realized he was standing on completely unfamiliar ground. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what came next. The breakfast rush in the resort cafe had begun to thin, leaving them with a rare moment of quiet. Lena, seemingly unaware of the tension that had simmered between the adults, was happily focused on her sugar packet masterpiece. Isabel, however, was quiet. too quiet. Nathan had spent enough time in high-stakes negotiations to know when someone was holding something back. And right now, Isabel was holding back an avalanche. He set his coffee cup down, the quiet clink drawing her eyes to him. "You've barely said a word since Sophia left." Isabel inhaled slowly, then exhaled just as carefully. She wasn't wrong. Nathan lifted a brow. "I gathered that much." Isabel's lips pressed together before she glanced at Lena, ensuring she was still distracted. Then, lowering her voice, she said, "I know you think I made this decision out of spite, Nathan. That I shut you out for no reason." He didn't respond. Because a part of him did think that. Or at least he had. Until he saw her last night. Until he saw Lena. Until he realized that despite everything, Isabel had been scared. Not of him, but of what he might do. Isabel sighed, rubbing her forehead. "I never wanted to keep her from you forever, but I also—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to be a father, Nathan. Not really." Something hot and sharp twisted in his chest. "That wasn't your choice to make." Isabel flinched. "You're right. But back then, it felt like the only choice I had." Nathan clenched his jaw, willing himself to stay calm. "You don't think I had the right to know?" "I do." Isabel's voice softened. "And I regret not telling you sooner. But the man you were 3 years ago? He wasn't ready for this." Nathan stiffened. "And you think I am now?" "I don't know yet." Her honesty cut deeper than any accusation could have. He studied her, the woman he had once loved, the only woman he had ever truly loved, and tried to see himself through her eyes, the man she had left, the man he was now. The difference between the two felt like an unsteady bridge, built over a past they had never fully addressed. Before he could say anything, Lena reached for Isabel's sleeve, tugging lightly. "Mama?" Isabel turned, immediately shifting into mother mode. "What is it, sweetheart?" Lena held up her sugar packet pyramid proudly. "It's a castle." Nathan blinked. "That's a castle?" Lena nodded solemnly. He pretended to inspect it closely. Looks more like a corporate headquarters." Lena frowned. "No." Isabel let out a small, surprised laugh. Nathan glanced at her, catching the way her face softened, her guard momentarily slipping. It had always been like this between them, this natural back and forth, this easy rhythm that neither of them had ever had to force. But things were different now, because no matter how much his heart remembered the way she used to smile at him, no matter how much he wished things could be simple again, there was a child between them now, a child who deserved more than their unresolved past. Nathan straightened, his expression turning serious again. "I want to be in her life, Isabel." Isabel tensed, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "Nathan, I don't expect it to happen overnight," he continued, "but I want to know her. I want her to know me." Isabel exhaled slowly. "That's not just up to me." Nathan looked at Lena, who was now carefully restacking her castle after a slight collapse. She was still so young, so unaware of the storm happening between the two people who had created her. "I know," he admitted. Isabel studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, she spoke. "We take it slow." Nathan nodded. "Her pace, not yours," Isabel added. His jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded again. Isabel hesitated, as if she had more to say, but before she could, Lena let out a small, triumphant noise. "All done." She held up her reconstructed castle, beaming. Nathan looked at her, really looked at her, and something inside him softened. He hadn't earned her yet, hadn't earned Isabel's trust, hadn't earned his daughter's affection. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about the next move or the next battle. He was thinking about her, and how, no matter what it took, he wasn't going to walk away this time. Nathan wasn't used to waiting. His entire career had been built on decisiveness, on making things happen, on pushing forward when others hesitated. But this was a different kind of battle. He had spent the past 2 days slowly, carefully inserting himself into Lena's world. Not pushing, not demanding, just being there. Breakfasts at the resort's cafe, short walks along the beach, simple conversations about puzzles, pancakes, and the shapes of the clouds overhead. And Lena? She was starting to let him in. It was subtle. A glance that lasted a little longer. A shy smile when he said something funny. The way she reached for her mother's hand a little less when he was around. Isabel saw it too. She wasn't ready to say it out loud, but Nathan could tell. The wary edge in her posture was softening, the steel in her voice easing. She was still protective, still skeptical, but she was watching, waiting. And Nathan was determined not to let her down. That afternoon, Isabel had planned to take Lena to a nearby park, something quieter, away from the luxury and shine of the resort. Nathan had invited himself along before she could tell him no. Lena didn't seem to mind. She sat between them in the back seat of the car Isabel had rented, her small hands resting in her lap as she hummed a quiet tune. Nathan glanced at her. "What song is that?" Lena looked up, her green eyes bright. "It's from my favorite movie." Nathan smiled. "Which one?" She hesitated, then looked at Isabel. "Tell him," Isabel encouraged gently. Lena bit her lip, then mumbled, "The Princess and the Frog." Nathan blinked. Of all the movies he had expected his daughter to love, that hadn't been one of them. "Good choice," he said after a moment. Lena studied him as if trying to gauge whether he actually meant it. Then shyly she said, "Mama says the best princesses save themselves." Nathan turned to Isabel, lifting an eyebrow. She shrugged. "I'm raising her to be smart." He smirked, looking back at Lena. "Well, your mom's not wrong." Lena beamed. And just like that, something in Nathan's chest eased. The car pulled up to the park a few minutes later. It wasn't crowded, just a few other parents with their kids, the quiet lull of an afternoon settling over the space. Lena practically bounced out of the car, her tiny feet hitting the pavement as she ran toward the playground. Nathan watched, his throat tight. This was what he had missed. Tiny moments, little milestones. The simple joy of seeing his daughter run toward a set of swings with no hesitation, no fear. He exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "You okay?" Isabel's voice was quieter now. Nathan turned to her. She was standing beside him, her arms crossed over her chest, her dark hair catching the wind. He considered lying, saying he was fine. But that wasn't what this was anymore. So instead he said, "No." Isabel looked at him, something flickering in her gaze. Nathan exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. 3 years, Isabel. She's had 3 years of life, and I wasn't there for any of it. Isabel sighed. "I know." "That's not—" He shook his head. "I'm not blaming you, I don't know how to fix it." Isabel studied him, her gaze softer than it had been in years. Finally, she said, "You don't fix it, Nathan. You show up. You prove to her that you're not going anywhere." Nathan swallowed hard. "And what about you?" Isabel stiffened. His voice was lower now. "What will it take for you to trust me again?" Isabel looked away, watching as Lena climbed onto a swing, her little legs kicking as she tried to propel herself forward. Nathan knew she wasn't ready to answer, and for once, he was willing to wait. For her, for their daughter, for the life he was finally ready to fight for. Nathan hadn't expected Isabel to answer his question. Not now. Not while the weight of their history loomed between them, heavy and unspoken. But still, when she turned away, when she refused to meet his eyes. It burned. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back as he watched Lena pump her little legs on the swing, determination set in her tiny face. She wasn't quite strong enough to gain momentum on her own, but she kept trying. Nathan took a step forward, instinct guiding him more than thought. He crouched down behind her, hands bracing gently on the swing's chains. "Need some help?" Lena twisted slightly, looking over her shoulder. For a moment she hesitated, then, just as quickly, she nodded. Nathan swallowed the tightness in his throat. "All right," he murmured. "Hold on." Lena's fingers gripped the chains, small but firm. Nathan gave the swing a gentle push. Lena let out a small, delighted sound as she soared forward, the wind catching in her curls. He pushed again, a little stronger this time, watching as her laughter rang through the air, bright and weightless, free in a way he wasn't sure he had ever felt. He should have been here for this, for every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every tiny perfect moment like this. Regret settled deep in his chest, heavier than he knew how to carry. Behind him, Isabel's voice was soft. "She likes you." Nathan turned his head slightly, catching the way Isabel's gaze lingered on their daughter. "She doesn't know me," he corrected. Isabel's lips pressed together. "But she wants to," she admitted, finally looking at him. "That matters, Nathan." Nathan inhaled slowly. "And you?" Isabel stiffened. His gaze stayed steady, unwavering. "Do you want to know me again, Isabel?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest, eyes flickering toward Lena as if searching for an escape. But Nathan didn't let her run. Not this time. "I never stopped knowing you," Isabel said finally, her voice quiet. That was the problem. Nathan's jaw tightened. "What does that mean?" She sighed, rubbing a hand over her temple. "It means I knew who you were back then. I knew where I ranked. I knew that no matter how much I loved you, I'd always be standing in the shadow of your empire." Nathan stared at her, pulse thrumming in his ears. "I didn't want our daughter to grow up feeling like an afterthought." Isabel continued, her voice raw now. "So yes, I made a choice, a hard one, a choice that I will always wonder about." Nathan clenched his fists. "You should have given me a chance, Isabel." Isabel let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "Would you have taken it?" Nathan opened his mouth, then shut it. Because she was right. 3 years ago he wouldn't have. Not because he wouldn't have loved his daughter, but because he hadn't known how to be anything other than the man building an empire. And Isabel had known that before he had. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not that man anymore." Isabel studied him, her expression unreadable. "Then prove it." Nathan swallowed hard. "How?" Isabel hesitated. Then, before she could answer, Lena's voice cut through the silence. "Higher." Nathan turned just in time to catch the beaming, impatient look on his daughter's face. And suddenly nothing else mattered. He pushed the swing higher. And for the first time, Nathan didn't feel like he was standing in the shadow of his own life. He felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Nathan had spent years perfecting the art of control. Every decision, every move, calculated. His world was a carefully built machine, and he had never allowed anything to disrupt it. Until now, until her, until them. The afternoon at the park had shifted something inside him, but as he walked beside Isabel on the quiet path leading back to the car, he could feel the tension thickening between them. It wasn't just history. It was the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future pressing in, demanding to be acknowledged. Lena was a few steps ahead, hopping along the sidewalk, her little fingers brushing the tops of the flowers lining the path. She was humming again, that same song from earlier, lost in her own world. And Isabel? She looked like she was on the verge of running. Nathan exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. You still don't believe I'm staying, do you? Isabel stiffened but didn't stop walking. It's not that simple. Yes, it is, he countered. You either trust that I mean what I say or you don't. Isabel let out a quiet, sharp laugh. You say that like trust is easy. For us? No, Nathan admitted. But for her? He nodded toward Lena. She deserves that much, Isabel. Isabel's footsteps faltered. Nathan slowed, watching as she inhaled deeply, her shoulders rising and falling with the weight of his words. Then finally she turned to face him. You're right, she said softly. She does. For a split second, hope sparked in his chest. But then, that's why I'm thinking about leaving. Nathan went completely still. The words hit like a gut punch, knocking the air from his lungs before he could stop it. He stared at her, trying to make sense of what she had just said, trying to breathe through the sudden, sharp panic clawing at his chest. Leaving? His voice was dangerously low. Isabel glanced toward Lena, then back at him. We weren't planning to stay here long. This was just... She hesitated. It was supposed to be a short trip. Nathan's hands curled into fists. And now? Isabel exhaled, her expression torn. I don't know. Nathan clenched his jaw. You're running. I'm protecting her. His temper flared, hotter than it had in years. From what, Isabel? From me? Isabel's lips parted, but she hesitated. And in that single moment of silence, Nathan knew. She still didn't trust him, not fully. Not yet. His chest felt tight, the anger mixing with something deeper, something raw and desperate that he didn't know how to contain. You can't just leave, he said, voice rough. Isabel's eyes flashed. And you can't just expect me to forget the past, Nathan. Nathan ran a hand over his face, forcing himself to steady his breath, steady his emotions. For years he had controlled every aspect of his life. But this was slipping through his fingers. Look, Isabel said finally, her voice softer now, tinged with exhaustion. I don't want to hurt you. Nathan let out a bitter laugh. Too late for that. Isabel flinched. And for the first time since this started, she looked just as lost as he felt. She was scared. Scared of letting him in. Scared of what it would mean if she did. And God help him. So was he. But fear had never dictated Nathan Caldwell's life before. And it wasn't going to start now. He took a step closer, closing the distance between them. Give me time, he said, his voice quieter now, pleading, but firm. Give me the chance to prove that I'm not going anywhere. Isabel swallowed hard, her gaze flickering between his eyes, searching for something. For what? A reason to believe him? A reason to stay? For one endless second she said nothing. Then, Mommy? Both of them turned. Lena was standing a few feet away, clutching a small flower in her hands, tilting her head in confusion at the tension she could sense but not understand. Nathan immediately forced himself to breathe. He had to pull himself together. For her. For them. Isabel took a slow step back, straightening as she turned to Lena. Yes, baby? Lena held up the flower. For you. Isabel smiled. A real smile, small but aching with love. She crouched down, brushing Lena's curls back as she took the flower. Thank you, sweetheart. Lena beamed. Then, after a second, she turned to Nathan. Nathan stilled. For a moment he thought that was it, that the moment was over. But then, without hesitation, Lena plucked another tiny flower from the bush beside her and held it out to him. Nathan's breath caught. He crouched down slowly, carefully, his entire chest tight with emotion. You sure? He murmured. Lena nodded, her small hand outstretched. Nathan reached for the flower, fingers brushing against hers. It was the smallest thing, a simple, delicate gesture. But in that moment, it was everything. He looked up at I. She was watching him, her lips parted slightly, eyes filled with something she wasn't ready to say out loud. Nathan turned back to Lena, his grip tightening slightly around the fragile stem in his hands. "Thank you, sweetheart," he murmured. And for the first time since finding out she existed, she smiled just for him. Nathan sat on the terrace of his penthouse suite, the Miami skyline glittering in the distance. The warm breeze carried the scent of salt and jasmine, but he barely noticed. His mind was stuck in a loop, replaying the moment Isabel had said she might leave. She's running. The thought gnawed at him. Nathan had built an empire on his ability to anticipate risks, on spotting threats before they could materialize. But nothing had prepared him for the possibility that, just as he was starting to know his daughter, she could be taken from him. The sound of his phone vibrating against the table pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Victor Langley. Nathan exhaled sharply, already regretting answering. "What?" A low chuckle came through the speaker. "That's no way to greet an old friend." "We were never friends." "No, but we were competitors, and I'd like to think we still are." Nathan clenched his jaw. Victor Langley was one of the few people in the industry who could make his blood boil. A venture capitalist who thrived on buying and dismantling companies, Langley had made it his mission to undermine Nathan at every turn. Nathan leaned back, gripping the edge of the table. "If you have something to say, say it." Victor's voice turned mockingly sympathetic. "I hear you've been distracted lately. A little family reunion, is it?" Nathan's body went still. Victor chuckled. "Oh, don't sound so surprised. Secrets don't stay secrets long in our world, Caldwell." A pause. "Imagine how your board would feel if they knew the great Nathan Caldwell was thinking about stepping back for a daughter he never even knew existed." Nathan's grip on his phone tightened. "Stay out of my business, Langley." "But it is my business," Victor countered. "Your absence leaves opportunities, and if you're not careful, someone else will step in to take what you've left behind." Nathan's mind raced. Victor wasn't just taunting him. He was making a move. "Enjoy Miami," Victor said smoothly. "I'll take care of things in the meantime." The call ended. Nathan's pulse thrummed with rage. He had spent years ensuring his company was untouchable, but now he was vulnerable. Not because he was weaker, but because, for the first time, he had something to lose. Isabel, Lena. They had shifted something in him, made him see what life could be beyond the boardroom. And now that very choice, to be with them, was being used against him. Nathan exhaled, forcing himself to steady his breath. He had fought men like Victor before, and he had won. He wasn't going to let this be any different. The next morning, Nathan was waiting outside the resort's cafe when Isabel and Lena arrived. Lena spotted him first. She hesitated for only a second before giving a small wave. Nathan's chest tightened as he lifted his hand in response. It wasn't much, but it was something. Isabel, however, was more guarded. She met his gaze as she approached, her expression unreadable. Nathan wasted no time. "We need to talk." Isabel tensed. "Nathan, alone." She glanced at Lena, who was already tugging on her hand, eager to go inside. Sophia appeared at just the right moment, her eyes narrowing at Nathan. "What now?" Nathan ignored her. He turned to Isabel. "Let me take a walk with you." Isabel hesitated. Sophia rolled her eyes. "I'll stay with Lena," she muttered, crossing her arms. "But if you make her cry, Caldwell, I'll kill you." Nathan barely acknowledged her as Isabel exhaled, giving a small nod. "Okay." They walked in silence for a while, the morning air thick with unspoken words. Finally, Nathan stopped near the edge of the terrace, overlooking the ocean. Isabel turned to him, her arms crossing protectively. "What's going on?" Nathan didn't waste time. "I know why you're running." Isabel's breath caught. Nathan's voice softened, but the intensity remained. "It's not just about trust. It's about fear." Isabel looked away. "Nathan, you're scared that if I walk away it'll break her." His jaw clenched. "And you're scared that if I stay I'll break you." Her eyes snapped back to his, anger flickering beneath the surface. "You don't get to—" "I do," he interrupted, stepping closer, "because I know what I was, Isabel. And I know what I'm not anymore." Isabel's throat worked as she swallowed. Nathan's voice was quieter now, but no less firm. "I want to be in her life, but I also want to be in yours." Isabel inhaled sharply. "Nathan, don't— I still love you." The words hung between them, thick and heavy. Isabel's breath stuttered. Nathan didn't move, didn't rush. He let the truth settle. Because for once, he wasn't fighting for a deal. He was fighting for them. "I don't expect you to say it back," he said finally. "I just need you to know." Isabel's hands trembled at her sides. She turned away, staring at the ocean like she could find the answers in the waves. Nathan waited. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know if I can do this again." Nathan swallowed. "Then let me show you that you can." Isabel turned back to him, her expression torn. "Nathan—" A sudden small voice cut through the tension. "Mommy?" Nathan's chest tightened as he turned to see Lena standing a few feet away, blinking up at them with wide, innocent eyes. For a second, everything went still. Then, Lena did something that shattered Nathan's entire world. She reached for his hand. Not Isabel's. His. Nathan sucked in a breath, frozen as those tiny fingers curled around his own. Isabel's eyes widened. Nathan looked down at Lena, his heart hammering. She was watching him, her grip tentative. But there, a silent decision, a silent trust. Nathan swallowed hard. This wasn't a deal. This wasn't power. This was love. And for the first time in his life, he finally understood what that meant. Nathan had won wars in boardrooms with nothing but sheer will and the force of his presence. He had outmaneuvered men twice his age, bent markets to his advantage, and built a legacy that carried his name across the world. But this was the first real victory that mattered. Lena's tiny hand wrapped around his own was so small, so fragile, and yet it carried the weight of something profound. She had chosen him, not because she had to, not because Isabel had nudged her forward, but because in her quiet, cautious way, she was telling him she trusted him. And Nathan Caldwell had never been more terrified of losing anything in his life. He swallowed, forcing his emotions into something steady, something she wouldn't see through. "Hey, sweetheart," he murmured. Lena blinked up at him. "Are you sad?" Nathan stiffened. He had always prided himself on being unreadable, on making sure no one ever saw more than what he wanted them to. But somehow this little girl, his daughter, had already cracked him wide open. He crouched down, keeping her hand in his. "No," he said softly. "Not sad." She tilted her head, considering this. "Then what?" Nathan exhaled slowly, feeling Isabel's gaze on him but keeping his focus on Lena. "I think," he said carefully, "I'm just really happy you're here." Lena's tiny fingers tightened slightly. Just a small squeeze, but one that sent something deep and unshakable through Nathan's chest. Then, just as quickly, she let go and ran back toward the cafe. Nathan stayed where he was, watching her disappear through the doors, feeling like he had just survived something monumental. Isabel hadn't moved. He could feel her watching him, the air between them thick with something neither of them knew how to name yet. Finally he stood, rolling his shoulders back before looking at her. "She's letting me in." It wasn't a question. Isabel inhaled, her arms still crossed tightly over her chest. "Yes." Nathan nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. "So what happens now?" She hesitated. He saw it, the war inside her, the push and pull of wanting to believe in him and being too scared to try. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't want to make promises I can't keep." Nathan's jaw clenched. "And what about the promises I want to make?" Isabel exhaled sharply. "Nathan." "No," he cut in, voice low but firm. "I need you to hear me, Isabel. I'm not leaving. I don't care how much you push. I don't care how much you try to convince yourself it's easier if you walk away. I am not leaving my daughter." Something flickered across her face. Anger, sadness, relief. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You say that now. I say that because it's the truth." Isabel flinched. Nathan forced himself to breathe, to soften. "I lost 3 years, Isabel." His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. "I can't change that, but I can make sure I don't lose another second." She swallowed hard, looking away. "You don't get it." "Then make me get it," Nathan pushed. Isabel closed her eyes for a long moment before opening them again, her expression raw. "I have spent every day since she was born making sure I never let her down." Her voice shook just slightly. "I made hard choices, maybe the wrong ones. But I did it alone, Nathan." His chest tightened. "I don't know how to let someone else be a part of this," she admitted. "Not after all this time." Nathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Then let me figure it out with you." Her gaze snapped to his. "I don't expect you to trust me overnight," he said, voice rough. "But I need you to let me try." The silence between them stretched. For a moment Nathan thought she might say no, that she might do what she always did, pull away, shut him out. Then, finally, Isabel let out a slow, shuddering breath. "Okay." Nathan stilled. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't an "I forgive you." But it was a start. And right now, that was everything. Nathan had never been good at patience. His entire life was built on forward momentum, pushing, conquering, winning. But standing here, staring at Isabel as she hesitantly gave him space in their daughter's life, he realized this was the one thing he couldn't force his way through. This wasn't a deal to close. This was trust, earned, not demanded. And for the first time in his life, he was willing to wait. That evening, Isabel knocked on his penthouse door. Nathan had been expecting her. He wasn't sure how he knew, but he had felt the shift between them at the park, the way her defenses were still there, but slightly worn, the way she had said okay, not as a certainty but as an opening. He opened the door to find her standing there, arms crossed, hair still damp from a shower, her simple dress clinging to her frame in a way that made it very difficult to focus. "Can we talk?" Nathan stepped aside, letting her in. The suite was quiet, the city skyline sprawling outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Isabel moved toward them, arms still crossed, her expression unreadable. "I don't want to fight with you," she said, staring at the city lights. Nathan exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "That makes 2 of us." Isabel turned slightly, studying him. Lena, you being here, it's bringing up things I don't know how to deal with." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Like what?" Isabel let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "Like the fact that I never stopped loving you." The words hit him like a blow. Nathan froze, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Isabel looked away, shaking her head. "That's the problem, Nathan. It wasn't just that I left because I didn't trust you to be there for her. I left because it hurt too much to stay. Nathan swallowed hard. For years he had told himself that Isabel had walked away because she didn't want him anymore. But now, looking at her, seeing the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides, he realized the truth. She had left because she loved him too much to keep breaking her own heart. Nathan took a step forward. "You should have told me." Isabel laughed softly, shaking her head. "And what would you have done, Nathan? Would you have fought for me?" Nathan's chest tightened, because 3 years ago he knew exactly what he would have done. Nothing. He would have let her go, convinced himself that love was a distraction, that emotions had no place in his world. But now... Nathan reached out, gently tilting her chin so she had no choice but to look at him. "I'm fighting now." Isabel sucked in a sharp breath, her gaze locked onto his. And for the first time in years, she didn't pull away. They talked for hours, about everything they had avoided for so long, about the past, the mistakes, the things left unsaid. Isabel told him about the nights she had stayed up, debating whether to call him. Nathan told her about the moments when silence had been unbearable, but pride had kept him from reaching out. By the time the conversation lulled, the tension between them had shifted. Not gone, but different. Nathan reached for her hand, tracing small circles against her palm. "I don't want to spend another day pretending you and Lena aren't the most important thing in my life." Isabel swallowed hard. "Nathan." He squeezed her fingers gently. "I know you're scared." His voice softened. "So am I." Isabel searched his gaze, looking for cracks. She wouldn't find any. Finally, she exhaled, resting her forehead against his. And for the first time, Nathan knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Nathan wasn't sure when Isabel had drifted off to sleep. They had spent hours talking, the weight of the past unraveling between them in slow, cautious confessions. And yet, despite all the pain, despite the regrets that still clung to every unspoken word, she had stayed. She had let him in. Now she was curled up on the couch beside him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. The city lights spilled in through the vast windows of his penthouse, casting a soft glow across her face. For the first time in 3 years, she looked at peace, and Nathan. He was terrified to move, afraid that if he did, this moment would disappear. The man he had been before, the version of himself who let her go, would have already started pulling back, already begun calculating the risk of letting her in again. But that man was gone. Nathan had spent years believing that success meant control, that emotions were a liability, that love, real love, only slowed you down. And yet, staring at Isabel now, feeling the warmth of her body next to his, he knew this was what had been missing all along. Her. Them. Isabel stirred slightly, her lashes fluttering open. Nathan stilled, expecting her to pull away, expecting the moment to break. Instead, she let out a sleepy exhale, lifting her head just enough to meet his gaze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Isabel whispered, "You're still here." Nathan's throat tightened. "Yeah," he murmured. "I'm here." A flicker of something unreadable passed through her expression. She let out a soft breath, pulling her legs up beneath her. "I don't know what this is," she admitted, voice quiet. "I don't know how to trust that it's real." Nathan didn't flinch. "I get it," he said simply, "but I also know I'm not leaving this time." Isabel hesitated. "Nathan, no." His voice was firm, but gentle. "No more running, no more pretending this doesn't matter." Isabel swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of the couch. Nathan reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Do you still love me?" She inhaled sharply, her eyes flickering with something raw. Then, finally, she whispered, "Yes." Nathan exhaled, relief crashing through him like a wave. "But that's not the problem," Isabel added quickly, shaking her head. "Loving you was never the problem, Nathan. It was everything else. The late nights. The way you always put work first. The way I felt like I was competing for space in your life." Nathan tightened his grip on her hand. "I know." She looked away. "What if nothing's changed?" Nathan reached up, gently tilting her chin back toward him. "Everything has changed, Isabel." She searched his gaze, looking for doubt. She wouldn't find any. "I want this," he said, his voice steady. "Not just you. United States. Our family." Isabel exhaled shakily. She wanted to believe him. He could see it, and maybe, just maybe, she was starting to. Nathan leaned in just close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath. "Let me prove it to you." Isabel's lips parted slightly, her pulse visible at the base of her throat. Then, just as softly, she whispered, "Okay." And as Nathan closed the space between them, pressing his lips to hers for the first time in 3 years, he knew. This was only the beginning. Nathan had never thought a single kiss could undo him. But Isabel's lips against his, warm, hesitant, yet familiar, felt like a thread unraveling something deep in his chest. 3 years had passed since he last held her like this, since he last tasted the softness of her lips. Yet the moment their mouths met, it was as if no time had passed at all. Isabel didn't pull away, not immediately. For a few breathless seconds, she let herself melt into him. Her fingers curled slightly against his shirt, gripping him just enough to make his pulse stutter. Then reality crept in. She tensed. Nathan felt it instantly, the way her body stiffened, the way her breath caught like she was waking up from something she hadn't meant to fall into. Slowly she pulled back. Nathan didn't stop her, didn't chase her. Instead, he let his hands drop to his sides, studying her carefully. Isabel's eyes were wide, searching his face like she expected to find an answer there, something to make sense of what just happened. "We can't do this," she whispered. Nathan exhaled, his jaw tightening. "Why not?" She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. "Because it's too much. It's too fast, and She sucked in a shaky breath. "I don't trust this yet, Nathan." His chest tightened, but he nodded. He wasn't surprised. He hadn't expected one kiss to change everything, but damn if it didn't make him want to fight even harder for her, for them. Nathan took a careful step closer, lowering his voice. "I'm not asking you to trust me all at once. I know I have to earn that." Isabel bit her lip. "And if I can't?" Nathan reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. "Then I'll keep showing up until you can." She swallowed. For a long, quiet moment, she just looked at him. Then finally she whispered, "Okay." The next morning, Nathan found himself sitting at breakfast with Lena. Isabel had needed time, space, and for once Nathan was willing to give it to her. But Lena? She was already slipping into his life like she had always belonged there. She sat across from him in the resort cafe, swinging her little legs under the table as she focused intensely on the small bowl of strawberries in front of her. Nathan watched, fascinated as she carefully arranged them into a pattern. "You like things a certain way, huh?" he asked, leaning his forearms on the table. Lena nodded seriously, her curls bouncing. "Mommy says I'm particular." Nathan smirked. "Smart girl." Lena beamed. Then after a moment she glanced up at him with a look of cautious curiosity. "Are you going to be here tomorrow?" Nathan's chest tightened. She said it so casually, like she was testing the waters, like she wasn't sure what answer she was supposed to expect. Nathan didn't hesitate. "I'll be here every day you want me to be." Lena studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded, like she was filing that information away for later. Nathan's heart clenched. He had made billion-dollar deals. He had changed industries, built an empire, but nothing had ever mattered more than earning his daughter's trust. And he was ready to prove it, every single day. Nathan had spent his life chasing things: power, success, control. But as he stood on the balcony of his penthouse, watching Isabel and Lena below in the resort gardens, he realized something had changed. For the first time, he wasn't chasing. He was waiting for Isabel to decide if she could trust him again. Waiting for Lena to decide if she wanted him in her life permanently. Waiting for a future he wasn't used to hoping for. And yet, despite the uncertainty, he felt something unfamiliar but unmistakable settle in his chest. Peace. An hour later, he found Isabel on the beach, standing at the shoreline, the waves lapping at her bare feet. She didn't turn when he approached. For once, Nathan didn't rush the moment. He stood beside her, letting the ocean breeze fill the silence between them. Finally, Isabel spoke. "I called my landlord this morning," she said softly. Nathan stiffened, his chest tightening. "And?" She hesitated. "I told him I wouldn't be renewing my lease." Nathan's pulse roared in his ears. He turned to her slowly. "Where will you go?" Isabel finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know yet." Nathan swallowed. He had spent the last few weeks preparing himself for the possibility that she would leave, that Lena would slip through his fingers, that this, whatever it was between them, would never have a real chance. But this was something different. This was a door that hadn't closed yet. Nathan inhaled slowly. "Stay." Isabel's lips parted slightly. "Nathan, I'm not asking for forever," he said, voice steady. "I'm asking for now, for a chance." She searched his face. "I know I can't undo the past," Nathan admitted. "I know I can't fix what's already broken, but I can be better. For you. For Lena." Isabel let out a shaky breath. "I don't want you to try to be better, Nathan." His throat tightened. "Then what do you want?" She hesitated. Then finally, "I want you to be better." Nathan exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I already am." Isabel studied him, looking for cracks in his resolve. She wouldn't find any. Finally, she turned toward the water again, arms wrapping around herself. Nathan waited, letting her have the space to decide. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, "Okay." Nathan's breath caught. "Okay?" Isabel turned back to him, the ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "We'll stay. For now." Nathan wanted to reach for her, wanted to pull her against him and kiss her the way he should have years ago. But instead he just nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He wasn't going to rush this. He wasn't going to mess this up. Isabel tilted her head slightly, eyes shining. "You really would have let me walk away, wouldn't you?" Nathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "If it was what you needed." A slow, warm smile curved her lips. "That's how I know you've changed." Nathan let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Took me long enough?" Isabel smirked. "You've always been a little slow when it comes to the important things." Nathan reached for her hand, linking their fingers together. "Not this time." Isabel didn't pull away, and in that moment, Nathan knew. He had finally found something worth more than all the wealth in the world, and this time he wasn't going to let it go.